Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I've always joked that my youngest, Lucas, has a radar for the strangest kids in any room. But looking back on our first year in the Appalachian Mountains, I don't really laugh about it anymore. Wed moved from a busy little coastal town to a remote valley in eastern Kentucky after my husband took a job inspecting gas lines that snaked through the hills. The place we landed in was one of those tight-knit mountain communities where everyone has the same last names and the mist never really leaves the tree line. Lucas started 4th grade at the only elementary school in the county, a squat brick building pressed up against the edge of the woods. Hess always been social, easygoing, the kind of kid who makes friends before he learns where the bathrooms are, so I wasn't too worried about him fitting in. At first, everything seemed fine. The parents I met at pickup were the sort of people who brought crock-pot casseroles to PTA meetings and apologized if their trucks kicked gravel onto your car. I remember feeling relieved, like maybe this move would be good for all of us. Then I got the call. It was a gray Tuesday. One of those mountain days where the clouds sit so low you feel like you could reach up and push them away. The school secretary said the principal needed to see one of Lucas' parents as soon as possible about an incident after recess. My husband was up on a line 3 counties over, so it was on me. I drove the 15 minutes to the school with that tight, buzzing feeling in my chest, running through every worst-case scenario I could imagine. Lucas has never been an angel. We've had our share of backtalk and messy rooms, but violence is not in his nature. I kept thinking, if he hit someone, something really pushed him. When I signed in and they brought him up to meet me in the office, he wouldn't look at me. Normally, he talks so much he trips over his own stories. But that day, he was quiet, shoulders tense under his windbreaker. I tried to ask what happened as we walked down the hall to the principal's office, just a simple, "Are you okay?" And he just shook his head, lips pressed tight. That silence scared me more than any phone call. The principal, a heavy-set man with kind eyes named Mr. Walker, asked Lucas to wait on a bench outside and then motioned for me to sit in a vinyl chair across from his desk. He started with those measured questions adults ask when they're trying to decide how much of a problem they have on their hands. How is Lucas at home? Does he follow rules? Has he ever shown aggression towards siblings or pets? I told the truth. He's energetic, stubborn sometimes, but respectful, sensitive even. Not perfect, but not the kind of kid who goes looking for a fight. Mr. Walker nodded like that matched what he'd seen. Then he told me what had happened. After recess, when most of the kids had already lined up to go back inside, Lucas and another boy had been the last ones in the gravel lot behind the school. The other boy, Colton Reed, was someone I'd heard about already, mostly because Lucas talked about him on the drive home. According to Mr. Walker, the two of them were walking up the concrete steps by the edge of the ball field when Lucas suddenly and without apparent provocation swung his metal pencil box and hit Colton on the side of the head. Colton fell, started screaming, and a teacher from the back door ran out to help. There were no other kids around, no cameras, just a crying boy and Lucas standing there frozen, holding the box. I remember staring at Mr. Walker, struggling to picture my son doing that. The part that really bothered me was that both boys had told the exact same story independently when questioned, that Lucas had hit him. Nobody claimed it was an accident. No one said they'd been playing. Just that bare-bones version over and over. Mr. Walker said they weren't planning to suspend Lucas or anything. Scuffles happen, he told me, especially with boys that age. He just wanted to make sure I knew, and to ask that we talk to Lucas at home. His calmness actually soothed me a little. I left his office more confused than angry. On the drive home, I tried again to get Lucas to talk, and he just stared out the truck window at the rolling hills, eyes glassy. That quiet lasted all through dinner and homework and bath time. It wasn't until I tucked him in and turned off the light that I heard a small, shaky "Mom" float out of the dark. When I sat on the edge of his bed, he finally cracked. He told me that he hadn't really attacked Colton, that they'd been playing a game. Colton made up a kind of pretend fight he called Railroad Knockout. Something about taking turns, pretending to be the train and the person on the tracks. Lucas said Colton had told him, in that bossy way older kids do, that it would be more real if Lucas actually swung the pencil box, just a little. Lucas said he barely tapped him, but Colton threw himself backward, hit the ground, and started screaming like he'd been beaten. While Lucas stood there in shock, Colton leaned in, voice suddenly calm and flat, and whispered that if Lucas didn't tell the teachers Head hit him for real, Colton would finish the game in the woods, and Lucas wouldn't come back. That line stuck in my brain like a splinter. Lucas told the adults what he was told to say. I could feel anger rising in me, sharp and protective. My son had been used, and there was something else he mentioned that turned my stomach in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Earlier that week, Colton had taken Lucas down an overgrown path behind the school during recess, past where the teachers usually watched. There, tucked under a leaning pine, was what Colton called his clubhouse, really just a rotting piece of plywood propped against a rock. Inside, Lucas said, were rusted tools, old beer cans, and above them, nailed into the wood, the sun-bleached skull of some small animal, maybe a raccoon or a cat. Colton had traced the empty eye sockets with his fingers and told Lucas that when you stare long enough into the dark hollows, you can see how people really are underneath. Lucas said it in a rush, like he was finally getting it off his chest. That image bothered me more than I let on. I told Lucas Head done the right thing, telling me that what Colton did wasn't okay, and that I'd handle it. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the school directory open, running my finger down the page until I found the Reed's number. Colton's mother, Dana, answered on the second ring, her voice soft and a little breathless, like I'd caught her in the middle of something. I introduced myself and braced for defensiveness, but it never came. She told me Shed already heard about the incident from the school, that Shed gotten the real version out of Colton, and that she was mortified by what Head done. She apologized over and over. The more she talked, the more my anger tangled with something like pity. She confided that Colton had struggled for years with what doctors called behavioral and mood issues. She said sometimes he talked and moved like another person lived inside him, though she laughed weakly and said she knew that sounded dramatic. She mentioned they'd bounced between different counselors and small-town clinics from West Virginia to Tennessee, never staying in one place long. The way she said it, tired but resigned, made me wonder what I hadn't been told. Then she suggested something that, at the time, actually seemed sweet. A sleepover. Let the boys have a fresh start, she said. Let Colton apologize in person. Show Lucas he could be a normal friend. She offered to host at their place in the hollow just outside town. Against the part of me that hesitated, the part that replayed that animal skull and the threat in Lucas' ear, I agreed. I wanted to believe in second chances. That Saturday, I drove Lucas out to the Reed's place, a faded white farmhouse pressed up against the slope of the mountain. The road there wound past rusting trailers, skinny dogs, and the skeleton of what used to be a convenience store. The Reed's yard was crowded with old equipment, an overturned four-wheeler, a broken swing, a stack of firewood that looked like it had been there for years. But the flower boxes under the windows were full of bright petunias, and someone had painted the front door a cheerful blue. Dana greeted us on the porch with a wide, tired smile. Up close, she looked younger than I expected, barely older than me, with deep-set eyes and a quick, nervous way of glancing over my shoulder at the road. She welcomed us in, poured us coffee for me and lemonade for Lucas, then called down the narrow hallway for Colton. When he came down the creaking stairs, my first thought was how small he looked for a boy with such big stories attached to his name. He had dark, tangled hair and a wary, restless expression. He mumbled an apology to Lucas without quite meeting his eyes. They disappeared down a set of steep basement steps to play video games and check out Colton's setup. Dana and I stayed upstairs, sitting at a scarred kitchen table while the light outside shifted from bright to dim, washing the mountains in that blue-gray color they get just before dusk. She opened up more as the evening went on. She admitted that Colton had been asked to leave more than one school over the years, that some doctors had thrown around heavy words like conduct disorder, and dissociation. She insisted Head never seriously hurt anyone, that he mostly just acted off and scared people. I listened, nodding, telling myself I was being paranoid to still feel uneasy. Then, the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a quick dimming, and I assumed it was just an old house getting temperamental. But then I heard a thud from the basement. Not a crash, not a shout, just a single heavy impact that made something inside me go cold. Dana called down the stairs, asking if everything was okay. There was a pause, long enough for my imagination to sprint ahead. And then Lucas' voice floated up, thin and too bright, saying they were fine. I didn't buy it. I excused myself, said I wanted to say goodnight before I left, and made my way down the narrow stairs. The basement smelled like damp concrete and old laundry. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. The boys stood in the middle of the room, a few feet apart. The TV was off. On the floor between them was a chalk circle, fuzzy around the edges, like it had been drawn and scrubbed away and drawn again over time. Lucas' wrist was trapped in Colton's hand, fingers digging in hard enough that I could see white marks where his skin paled. Neither of them was talking when I stepped off the last stair. They both looked up at me at the same time, and for a second, the room felt wrong in a way I can't quite explain. Then Colton spoke in this flat, almost syrupy tone, saying they'd just been acting out a scene from a movie, and he let go of Lucas like it was no big deal. Lucas forced a smile, but his eyes darted to the circle and back to me. I decided not to make a scene in someone else's home. I kissed Lucas on the head, told him I loved him, and drove back down that winding road with a knot in my stomach. It was hours later, when I went to bed, that the unease turned into something closer to dread. The next morning, when I pulled back up to the Reed's place to pick Lucas up, everything looked perfectly ordinary. The mist was hanging low over the ridge, the petunias were still bright, and there was Lucas on the porch with his sleeping bag, smiling like the night had been nothing but popcorn and video games. Dana waved from the doorway with a mug of coffee in her hand. We made small talk, and then I loaded Lucas into the truck. We hadn't even reached the main road when his composure cracked. He started crying suddenly, shoulders shaking, trying to apologize for ruining everything before Head even told me what happened. I pulled off onto a gravel turnout and turned to face him. What he described next has never really left me. Sometime in the middle of the night, he said, he woke up on the basement floor. The air mattress had gone a little flat, so he thought that was why at first. The room was dark except for a thin sliver of light coming from the half-finished bathroom at the far end of the basement. The door was cracked, and something inside was flickering, not like the overhead bulb, more like a candle. Lucas heard whispering. It took him a second to realize it was Colton's voice. He assumed at first that Colton was on the phone, but the more he listened, the stranger it sounded. Lucas said it was like hearing someone practice being different people, answering questions no one had asked out loud. Colton wasn't calling himself Colton. He was referring to himself as Harlan, which Lucas recognized as the name of the county we lived in. Harlan says we can't stay, Lucas remembered hearing. Harlan says we try again down the line. The way he imitated the cadence, low and rhythmic, raised goosebumps on my arms even as I tried to stay rational. Lucas peeked just enough to see Colton standing in front of the bathroom mirror, a candle on the sink throwing his face into strange angles. He wasn't holding a phone. He was just staring at his own reflection, whispering, pausing, then whispering again in a lower voice as if replying. At one point, Lucas swore he heard Colton ask, "What if the next one tells?" And then fall silent like he was listening for an answer only he could hear. Eventually, the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. Lucas squeezed his eyes shut and lay as still as he could, trying to slow his breathing. After what felt like forever, he heard the bathroom door creak open. Soft footfalls crossed the cold concrete. Then he felt breath on his face and heard more whispering right above him. This time, he said, the words didn't sound like words at all. Just a string of syllables, too fast and soft to catch, the way someone might sound if they were rehearsing language rather than speaking it. He kept his eyes shut. Every instinct in him screamed not to move. After a while, the whispering stopped, Colton walked back to his own mattress and lay down. In the morning, he was cheerful, making jokes about whose breath smelled worse, acting like nothing had happened. Lucas didn't say a word until we were in the truck. I listened, torn between the urge to turn around and storm into that farmhouse and the awareness that we were dealing with something far beyond a normal kid conflict. I called Dana that afternoon, my hands shaking. At first, she laughed weakly, said Colton had always been imaginative. But when I mentioned the name Harlan and the way he'd spoken into the mirror, her voice shifted. The pauses between her sentences grew longer. She admitted, in a low voice, that one psychiatrist had suggested he might be experiencing something like a dissociative disorder, the kind where people slip into different states and don't remember what they've done. She said they'd moved more than once after incidents at school got out of hand, that she hadn't told me because she was afraid we wouldn't give them a chance in this new town. Then she asked me, almost pleaded, not to tell the school about the sleepover, not to add fuel to the fire while they were so close to getting him stabilized. I didn't trust my own voice, so I muttered something non-committal and hung up. I told myself I'd think about it, that I'd make a decision before the week was out. I never got that far. On Monday, an email went out from the district saying there had been a serious behavioral event on the playground and that appropriate action had been taken. By the end of the day, through the grapevine of other parents, I heard that Colton had attacked another child at recess, this time with a rock from the creek bed behind the school. The other boy needed stitches. Colton was expelled on the spot. When I tried to call Dana, her number gave a flat, mechanical message that the line had been disconnected. Over the next few days, the entire town hummed with quiet speculation. Some people said they'd seen a moving truck up at the Reed's place. Others swore Dana's old Ford was still in the driveway. The not knowing burrowed under my skin until I couldn't stand it. A week later, on a rainy Thursday, I drove back up that hollow road. The Reed's mailbox was empty, the little blue house at the end of the gravel drive sitting quiet under the trees. No truck, no toys in the yard, just a faint rectangle of lighter paint on the front door where a wreath used to hang. The porch door was locked, and I didn't try to force it. I just stood there, listening to the drip of water off the eaves. It was only when I turned to leave that I noticed the basement windows tucked low along the foundation. The nearest one was grimy, half obscured by weeds. Still, I found myself stepping closer, wiping a circle in the dirt with the cuff of my jacket and peering inside. The basement was dim, lit only by the weak daylight sneaking in behind me. Dust motes drifted in the air. There was an old couch, a tipped-over laundry basket, a bare mattress on the floor. On the far wall, just to the right of where I'm pretty sure that bathroom door stood, I could make out something that didn't fit. Rows of vertical marks, dark against the concrete, etched at the height of a child's reach. At first I thought they were just scuffs or shadows, but the longer I squinted, the clearer they became dozens, maybe hundreds of narrow lines, clustered and overlapping like tally marks made and remade over time. Beside them, tacked crookedly to the wall, were pieces of paper, even through the glass. Even at that angle, I could see faces on them crudely drawn with pencil or charcoal, some smiling, some frowning, some with their eyes scratched out, children's faces, over and over. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. I stepped back, my heartbeat loud in my ears, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Maybe there was a perfectly clinical explanation for all of it, some therapist's exercise, some broken system's idea of treatment in a forgotten part of the country. Maybe Colton was just a very sick boy in a place that didn't have enough help to give him. Or maybe the truth wasn't mine to know. I drove home in a daze. Years have passed since then. Lucas is in high school now, lanky and sarcastic, more interested in car engines and girls than childhood games in the woods. He barely remembers Colton except as that weird kid from Kentucky he tells stories about at parties. I don't have that luxury. The image of that chalk circle, that candlelit bathroom mirror, those faces on the wall, they surface in my mind at odd moments, usually when I'm watching my son from a distance and thinking how fragile it all really is. I still wrestle with the same question. Did I fail someone by staying quiet as long as I did? Or did I do the only thing a scared mother could do with the information she had? I don't know if there's a neat moral here. All I know is that out in those Appalachian hollows, under those low clouds and endless trees, there are families carrying things you'll never see from the road. Stories that never make it past the ridgeline. Sometimes I wonder where Colton ended up, and if another mother somewhere is telling a version of this story from the other side. If you've made it this far, I'm curious what you would have done in my place. Would you have called the school sooner, or handled it differently? Tell me honestly in the comments. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. Story 2. I grew up in a narrow valley in the central Appalachians. The kind of place where the mountains crowd in on both sides, and the highway feels like it's just borrowing space from the trees. Our house sat halfway up a gravel road outside a small West Virginia town you'd probably miss if you blinked, and most of what I believed about the world came from the white clapboard Baptist church perched on the ridge above us. In that church, we didn't really talk about ghosts or wandering spirits. If something strange happened, the adults said it was either God or the devil, and pretending otherwise meant you were ignoring what Scripture plainly said. I held on to that certainty like a life raft. My mother didn't. Her name was Carla, and if you'd met her on one of her good days, you might have even liked her. She was funny, quick with a sarcastic comment, and Shed joked that she and God had an understanding whenever I tried to get her to come up to the church with me on Sunday mornings. She wasn't an atheist, just uninterested, allergic to anything that looked like structure or obligation. As I got older, that difference between us opened into a real gap. I leaned into faith because it made the world feel ordered. She drifted toward the opposite, sliding deeper into prescription bottles and cheap liquor and whatever else she could get her hands on in a town where painkillers were easier to find than steady work. Looking back with adult eyes, it's obvious she was dealing with serious mental illness on top of addiction. Her moods could swing from affectionate to vicious in a heartbeat. Her sense of reality bending in ways that didn't make sense to anybody. But at the time, it just felt like living with a person who changed shapes whenever the sun went down. One of the first nights I realized how bad it really was started with a dream so vivid that part of me still isn't entirely convinced it was just a dream. I was 13. Lying in my narrow bed with the window cracked open to let in the cool mountain air and the sound of the creek. In the dream, my bedroom door flew open so hard it banged against the wall, and my mother stormed in, eyes wild and unfocused. She grabbed my wrist in a grip so tight it felt like bone grinding on bone, and shook me hard enough that my teeth clacked together. She was screaming words that didn't make sense, some mix of Bible phrases and accusations, telling me I thought I was better than her, that I was judging her with church eyes. I remember feeling sheer animal panic, trying to pull away and realizing I couldn't. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, arm throbbing where her fingers had dug in. Before I could fully tell myself it was just a nightmare, it happened again, only this time I was awake. The door burst open with the same sharp crack, and there she was in the faint light from the hallway, hair matted, pupils blown wide. The expression on her face was exactly what I'd just seen in my sleep. She grabbed my arm in the same place, shook me, her voice rising and falling like she was arguing with someone only she could hear. I pushed her away harder than I meant to and begged her to stop. Just as suddenly as Shed come in, she froze, blinked like Shed stepped out of a trance, and walked out of the room without another word. In the morning, when I confronted her at the kitchen table, she looked genuinely confused. She said she didn't remember coming into my room at all, acted hurt that I was accusing her of something so dramatic, and then, in that way, she had changed the subject to whether I'd taken out the trash. I told myself it was some bizarre overlap between dream and reality, that my half-asleep brain had exaggerated everything. But the bruises around my wrist lasted more than a week, yellow and purple and shaped unmistakably like fingers. That should have been enough to shake my certainty, but it didn't, not completely. A few weeks later, on a humid afternoon when the air felt thick and restless, I heard her screaming in the backyard. It wasn't a frightened sound, or even a pained one. It was high and almost joyful, a strange, excited shriek that didn't match any emotion I recognized. I ran outside, gravel biting into my bare feet, ready to see a snake, or a stranger, or some kind of injury. What I found made my skin crawl. My mother was standing near the tree line behind our house, grinning in a way that didn't look like her normal smile at all, holding a long black snake in both hands like it was a fire hose. The snake's body writhed and twisted, its tail whipping near her wrist. The thing is, she had been terrified of snakes my whole life. She couldn't even sit through a nature documentary if one slid across the screen. She'd cover her eyes and tell whoever was holding the remote to change it. I'd seen her cry over a snake in the driveway once, but now she was lifting this one up, letting it coil around her forearm, calling to me in a playful tone to come feel how smooth it is. She tilted her head at an angle that made her look almost unrecognizable, like a poorly drawn version of herself, and kept smiling wider each time I shook my head and backed away. I remember saying her name, asking what she was doing, but she just acted like she couldn't hear the fear in my voice. I bolted back inside, slammed the door, and watched from the window as she finally set the snake down. It slid off into the high grass, leaving her standing alone, breathing hard, hands trembling. By the time she came back inside, she was acting like nothing had happened. When I brought it up later that night, she laughed, told me I must have had another one of those crazy dreams, the same way she dismissed the episode in my room. It was infuriating, but there was something unnerving underneath the anger, the sense that her mind really was splintering, and that no amount of church or common sense could glue it back together. Around that same time, I started noticing smaller, quieter things that didn't fit. One night I woke up to a faint, repeated scraping beneath my bed. A slow drag and stop rhythm that made my stomach twist. I thought at first it was a mouse, or maybe the house settling, but the sound went on just long enough, just steady enough, that I finally got up and pressed my ear to the floorboards. The scraping was directly underneath me. Our house had a low, dirt-floored crawl space instead of a full basement, accessible from a hatch off the back porch. When I swallowed my fear, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the cool night air, I found the hatch already open. The beam of my flashlight caught dust swirling in the air and, further back, the outline of someone on their hands and knees. It was my mother, nails caked with dirt, fingers raking through the soil like she was trying to dig something up or bury it. I called her name, and she jerked up so fast she hit her head on a joist. When she turned toward the light, her expression was blank, as if she had no idea how she'd gotten there. She brushed past me without a word, went inside, and the next morning, when I tried to talk about it, she said I'd dreamed it, same as always. Standing on the porch and looking at that open hatch in the daylight, I could see clear drag marks in the dirt beneath the house, long grooves that led to a deeper, newly disturbed patch of soil. I never found the courage to dig there myself. That winter, our church held an overnight lock-in for the youth group, a way to keep us out of trouble during school break and, I suspect, to give exhausted parents one quiet night. I was relieved to go. Church, for all its flaws, felt predictable in a way home didn't. The building was old wood floors that creaked if you stepped in the wrong spots, stained glass that rattled in strong wind, a furnace that groaned to life like an old man climbing stairs, but I knew every inch of it. My mother dropped me off in the gravel lot just after dark, unusually sober and soft-spoken, even kissing my forehead before she drove off down the hill. For hours, we played games in the fellowship hall, ate too much pizza, and listened to the youth leader talk about temptation in that earnest tone adults use when they're trying to scare you straight. Around 4:30 in the morning, when the sugar crash really hit and most of us had settled into sleeping bags on the sanctuary floor, the noise started. It sounded like someone pounding on the outer wall of the church, 3 sharp knocks, then silence, then 3 more, circling the building. The sound moved in a way physical footsteps shouldn't have been able to, jumping from one side of the chapel to the other, as if whoever or whatever was making it didn't care about doors or distance. A couple of the younger kids started crying. I remember lying there, adrenaline spiking, trying to tell myself it was just some bored older kids from town messing with us. But the pattern of the knocking was too deliberate, too steady. At one point, it sounded like it was coming from every direction at once, vibrating through the old wood. The pastor, who was asleep in his office at the back of the church, hadn't heard any of it. When I finally worked up the nerve to wake him, he walked into the sanctuary with the bleary, annoyed look of a man who just had his 15 minutes of sleep stolen, and as soon as he stepped inside, the knocking stopped. He probably thought we were exaggerating, spooking ourselves. I watched him unlock the front doors and pull them open, expecting to see some teenagers on the steps. Instead, he actually recoiled. Standing barefoot on the ice-crusted concrete, coat hanging half off her shoulders, was my mother. Her hair was soaked with sweat despite the freezing air, and her lips were moving in a frantic whisper I couldn't make out. She didn't look at the pastor. Her eyes locked on me almost immediately, sweeping past every other kid in that room, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across her face, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. She walked toward me like I was the only person there. I wanted to stay where I was, to let the pastor or one of the adult chaperones step between us, but I felt rooted in place. When she reached me, she didn't say hello or explain why she was there. She just closed her fingers around my shoulder and steered me toward the door. The pastor murmured that I didn't have to go, that we could call my dad, but my mother said something low and sharp to him that I didn't catch, and he stepped back, hands raised. I still don't know if he was afraid of her or just unsure of what the right call was in that moment. The drive home was silent. I watched the dark shapes of trees blur past the window while she gripped the steering wheel hard enough that her knuckles went white. When we pulled into our driveway, she cut the engine but didn't get out right away. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, breathing in slow, measured pulls. When we finally went inside, she stopped in the hallway and watched me walk to my room like she was trying to memorize every step. I locked my door that night for the first time in my life. Lying in bed, heart hammering, I could hear her moving around the house, opening and closing drawers. At one point, the floorboards outside my room creaked, and I saw the shadow of her feet under the door, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. In the morning, the whole house carried a faint metallic smell I couldn't place until I walked into the kitchen and saw every knife we owned laid out in a perfect circle on the kitchen table, paring knives, steak knives, the big chef's knife we barely used, all of them arranged like some precise, silent ritual. My mother was at the stove, humming, making pancakes like it was any other Saturday. When she turned and saw me staring at the knives, she actually jumped, genuinely startled, and asked who had done that, as if she truly had no idea. Later, when I mentioned her showing up at the church in the middle of the night, she frowned and said she'd fallen asleep on the couch and woken up just in time to come pick me up that morning. It was like there were two separate timelines in her head, and only one of them included me. The worst part wasn't the denial. It was the way everyone else also seemed determined to act like nothing truly strange had happened. None of the adults from church brought it up again. No one asked if I was okay, or if maybe my mother needed help. In that part of the mountains, people had their own problems, their own secrets, and the unspoken rule was that you didn't look too closely at anyone else's. As the years went by, my mother's episodes blurred together. A night when she tore pages out of every Bible in the house and taped the verses to the bedroom walls like she was building herself a paper shield. Another when I found a small notebook tucked under her mattress, filled with erratic handwriting and shaky drawings of snakes coiled around church steeples and crosses tipped on their sides like fallen telephone poles. Reading those pages as an adult, you could easily diagnose paranoia and delusion. As a teenager, it just felt like walking through someone else's nightmare with no way to wake up. She died a few years later, long before her time, her body finally giving out under the constant strain of substances and untreated illness. The mountains move on quickly after a death. People bring casseroles, say the same handful of phrases about peace and God's plan, and then life slides back into its old grooves. The coal trucks still roar past, the creek still rises after a storm, the church still fills up on Sundays. On the surface, my own life has turned out okay. I moved away for a while, got an education, came back on my own terms. I don't know if I believe in demons the way I was taught anymore. I've seen enough of the world to know that human brains are perfectly capable of producing horrors all by themselves. But there are still nights when I wake up with my heart pounding. Sure, I've heard that circling knock on the walls again, or feel phantom fingers tightening around my wrist. On those nights, I lie awake and replay all the moments I've told you about, trying to force them into neat categories. This was psychosis. That was withdrawal. This part can be explained by trauma. Sometimes it works. And sometimes I'm left with nothing but questions and a hollow ache where certainty used to live. If you've had a parent or someone close to you who made reality feel slippery like that, I'd honestly like to hear how you make sense of it now. Do you chalk it all up to illness? Or do you leave room for something darker you can't quite name? Be real with me in the comments, because even after all these years, I'm still trying to decide what I believe about those nights in that little Appalachian town. Story 3. When my boys were little, we lived in an old 2-story farmhouse tucked into a narrow fold of the Appalachians. The kind of place where the mountains rise up on either side of you and the fog hangs low in the mornings like it doesn't want to leave. The house sat at the end of a long 1-lane road in southwest Virginia. Paint peeling, porch sagging. But it was ours, and in those early years I told myself the creaks and drafts and odd noises were part of its charm. My oldest, Caleb, was around 9 when the sleepwalking started. At first it was something I joked about to friends at work, one more quirky kid phase like refusing to eat vegetables if they touched anything else on the plate. I'm a light sleeper, and I'd wake up to the soft pad of bare feet in the hallway outside our bedroom, the kind of sound you feel more than hear. I'd find him standing there, always in the same spot just past our door, rocking slightly on his heels, his eyes wide open but focused on nothing. Anyone who has ever seen a sleepwalker knows that look. It's like their gaze goes straight through you and lands on some point far behind your shoulder. Sometimes his lips moved, murmur soft, but the words never quite formed. Other times he just breathed in this slow, steady way that felt almost staged, like he was imitating the idea of being calm while something else in his body was straining. It'd guide him gently back to bed, whispering his name, and in the morning he wouldn't remember a thing. For a while, that was all it was. Then came the tapping. One night I woke to a sound that didn't make sense at first. A slow, regular knock that my half-asleep brain tried to turn into rain on the window or a branch brushing the siding. But it was too measured, too precise. Tap, pause, as if someone was following a metronome only they could hear. My husband was snoring softly beside me. So I slipped out of bed and followed the sound into the hallway. There was Caleb, in his pajama pants and an old t-shirt, facing the wall opposite our bedroom door. He was standing so close, his nose almost touched the wallpaper, his forehead bumping lightly against it in that same slow rhythm he'd heard from bed. Each time he leaned in, his fingertips brushed the wall like he was searching for a seam, a way in. I said his name, very quietly, not wanting to startle him into hurting himself. He didn't react. Up close I could see that his eyes weren't totally blank. They flicked slightly left and right, tracking some invisible point on the wall. What unnerved me most, though, was the sound of the tapping itself. It didn't quite match what he'd expect from bone on plaster. Under that faded floral paper there was a different tone to it. A faint hollowness right at Caleb's eye level, as if there was something behind that section of wall that shouldn't have been empty. I hesitated long enough to feel that cold little ripple of dread, then put my hand on his shoulder and gave him a gentle shake. He blinked, leaned back, and let me turn him toward his room without a word. The next morning he joked about how tired he was, like any 4th grader who stayed up too late reading. And when I asked if Head had any weird dreams, he just shrugged. Life rolled on. The episodes happened again, but not often enough to feel urgent. Maybe once every couple of weeks he'd wake up to that same soft tapping in the hallway. Always in that spot, always the same pace. Sometimes there would be faint, greasy smudges on the wallpaper the next day, pale ovals where his forehead had been, and over time those marks formed a faint vertical path on the wall at his height, a ghostly track my husband never noticed. I told myself it was harmless. Sleepwalking runs in families, people say. Kids grow out of it. Eventually, Caleb did. We moved on to other worries, grades, friends, screens, all the small dramas of adolescence, and the nights got quiet again. Then my younger son, Mason, turned 8. and the whole thing started over. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence. He'd appear in the hallway after midnight, standing in almost the exact same spot his brother used to, shifting from foot to foot, eyes open but unfocused. The first time I saw him like that, every hair on my arms rose. Not because of anything dramatic he did, but because the posture, the angle of his head, the slow sway of his shoulders were all so familiar it felt like I was watching a recorded scene play on repeat. I reminded myself that kids mimic each other all the time, even unconsciously, and that Mason had shared a hallway with Caleb for years. The mind reaches for reasonable explanations first, because the alternative is admitting how little control you really have. For a while, the sleepwalking stayed simple. Then, just like before, I woke to a rhythmic tapping sound one night and knew, before my eyes were fully open, what I was going to find. I stepped into the hallway, and there he was. Mason, forehead gently knocking against the same patch of wallpaper, fingers tracing the same small circle on the wall like he was trying to wear it away. This time, though, there was a new detail. As I got close, I could hear him whispering between taps, soft enough that the words blurred together. I leaned in, careful not to touch him yet, trying to catch a phrase. Only one thing came through clearly, repeated between strings of nonsense syllables. 4 numbers, over and over, almost like a combination. 1978, whispered on an exhale, then swallowed by more mumbling. It was my husband's birth year, which I told myself was why it lodged in my brain. But the way Mason said it, toneless and precise, made it feel like something else. I coaxed him back to bed eventually, and in the morning he had nothing to offer but a blank stare when I asked if he remembered any dreams with numbers in them. I considered taking him to a doctor, but the nearest pediatric sleep specialist was 2 hours away over mountain roads, and by the time I worked up the energy to make an appointment, the episodes had tapered off again. Eventually, just like his brother, he outgrew it. Years slipped by. The boys left for college within a couple of seasons of each other, the way siblings often do, and the house that had creaked under the weight of school shoes and slammed doors settled into a strange quiet. With just my husband and me rattling around in all that space, we decided it was finally time to do the renovations Wed had been putting off for a decade. New floors to replace the ones that had warped from an old leak. Fresh paint to cover the nicotine stains that never quite went away. Maybe even an updated kitchen if we could stretch the budget. The hallway outside our bedroom was low on the priority list until we noticed how dingy the wallpaper looked in comparison to the freshly painted rooms. One Saturday, we dragged a trash can over, grabbed putty knives, and started stripping it off in long, satisfying strips. Underneath the first layer was another, an older pattern with faint vertical stripes, and under that, bare plaster, stained with age. By the time we reached the spot where the boys used to stand, it almost convinced myself I'd misremembered the exact location. Then my husband's scraper caught on something that wasn't paper or plaster, making a sharp, metallic screech. He peeled back a wide section of wallpaper, and my breath caught. Set into the wall, flush with the studs, was an old mirror about the width of a door frame, its edges framed with cracked wood that had been painted over more than once before someone finally decided to hide it completely. The glass itself was dark and spotted, the kind of antique silvering you see in thrift stores. But under the dust, our reflection still floated there, warped and slightly blurred. For a long beat, neither of us spoke. It was one thing to suspect there was something behind that hollow patch of wall. It was another to see that it had been a mirror, inches from where my sons had pressed their foreheads night after night. The first horror was the realization that they had somehow, in their sleep, gravitated to a concealed piece of glass they couldn't possibly have known about. The second came when I used the edge of my scraper to pry the mirror loose from its frame. It resisted at first, then popped free with a crunch of old plaster dust. The smell that spilled out of the cavity was a stale, trapped odor, like old clothing left in a damp trunk too long. I angled my phone flashlight into the dark space and saw that it wasn't solid wall behind the mirror at all. There was a narrow void, maybe 1.5 feet deep, running between the studs. On the far side of that void, confirming what I'd always known but never really thought about, was the back of another wall, our bedroom wall. For years, we'd been sleeping with our heads just feet away from this hidden slot in the house, separated only by plaster and paper. What made my skin crawl, though, were the marks. On the inside of the cavity, along the wood framing, were shallow grooves clustered at about shoulder height for an adult. They weren't the clean, even lines of a carpenter's pencil. They were jagged, uneven, like someone had scraped them in with a nail over and over, pressing harder each time. Mixed with those grooves were faint, overlapping words carved into the wood in shaky lettering. Pieces of sentences that didn't quite make sense. Can see. Don't let them. Listen. Near the bottom, where the beam met the plaster, there was a single word carved deeper than the rest. 1,978. My scalp prickled when I saw it. That same year, my son had whispered in the hallway, not knowing about any of this. I could have filed it away as coincidence, but the date had an immediate, mundane explanation too. Our house, according to a faded closing document still in our kitchen drawer, had been remodeled in 1978 by the previous owner, a widower who lived alone after his wife died. The mirror might have gone in then. The wall could have been opened and closed. Whatever had happened in that narrow space, long finished before we ever set foot across the threshold. Realizing that didn't make the scene feel any less wrong. We could have stopped there, taped new drywall over the opening, and pretended we'd never seen it. Instead, we cleared more debris out of the cavity and found the third detail that has stayed with me ever since. In the lower corner, tucked where you'd have to crouch to reach, was a small, round hole drilled through the far wall at about bed height, no wider than a pencil. On our side of that wall, where our headboard used to sit, there was a matching spot, a tiny plug of putty under a layer of paint, so neatly done that we'd never noticed it. Standing there in the dusty hallway, holding the mirror with shaking hands, I understood in a rush that whoever had cut that peephole and scratched those words into the wood hadn't been worrying about ghosts or curses. They'd been watching someone, maybe listening, maybe counting their breaths in the dark. That's the part that made the sleepwalking episodes feel less like random quirks and more like my boys had been unknowingly standing at a seam in the house where someone else's unease had once lived. There was no curse, no haunting, just the lingering shape of a person's fear etched into wood and plaster. We sealed the cavity properly, patched the hole from our side, and took the mirror straight to the dump instead of donating it. The rational part of my brain told me we'd done everything we needed to do. We'd removed a dangerous old fixture, fixed a structural oddity, closed up an invasion of privacy that had nothing to do with us. But in the nights that followed, as the house settled around its new walls and fresh paint, something in me stayed on edge. It'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, heart pounding for no obvious reason, and lie there listening to the silence, acutely aware of the thickness of the wall behind my head. On the phone, when I told Caleb and Mason about the mirror and the writing behind it, they both reacted like you might expect 2 college students to react. Caleb laughed, said it sounded like the setup for a horror movie, and joked that at least his sleepwalking had been good for something. Mason got quiet for a moment, then admitted he sometimes woke up in his dorm with a vague memory of standing in a hallway, pressing his head against something solid. He said it like he was confessing to a bad habit, not a haunting, and quickly brushed it off. They've both moved on, as kids do. The strange nights of their childhood are just stories to pull out at parties or to text each other when they're bored. But for me, that house in the mountains is where all those threads tie together, the rhythmic tapping in the dark, the whispered numbers, the oily forehead smudges on faded wallpaper, the hidden mirror with its carved please, the small, deliberate hole cut at bed height. I don't believe in anything supernatural living in those walls. What I believe in, now more than ever, is the way human fear and obsession can soak into a place, leaving behind a shape that other people feel without knowing why. Sometimes I wonder what else was hidden in that house before we ever arrived, and what future owners will sense without understanding when they walk down that same hallway at night. If you've read this far, I'm genuinely curious if you found something like that in your own home. Would you chalk it up to coincidence and bad design? Or would it change the way you sleep at night? Tell me honestly in the comments. I still haven't decided whether I overreacted or didn't take it seriously enough.